Tales from the Tavern, The Wizard, Part 7. A fortnight had passed since the incident with the Inquisitor, and our spirits rose like the tides. Unfortunately, my enthusiasm came to a premature end as I became very ill. Though winter still remained an uninvited guest, I could not afford to neglect the necessary duties that are required of me, no matter the state of my health. With each swing of the axe and shovel of snow, I became weaker and weaker. It did not take long for the wizard to notice my state. He became quite angry and demanded that I rest. He had no concern of the work that would go undone in my absence, and seemed quite confident that it would be of no consequence. I rested for many days. The wizard doted over me like a dutiful wife and attended to my every need. He forced me to drink of the most awful tasting tinctures he had concocted and eat regularly, even though I had no appetite. I confess that the wizard's methods, though quite unorthodox, were very effective. Slowly I began to recover. One day, as I lay in bed sneezing, wheezing, coughing and hacking, the wizard paid me a visit. I protested, stating that my stomach was already full to bursting and I had no desire to drink of his horrible tinctures. The wizard smiled and waved his hand at me. He said he simply wished to provide some company. I was very grateful, and we spoke of many things for some time. Then the wizard broke the brief silence and asked,
"Have you heard the story of the farmer and the tyrant?"
I had never heard of such a tale, and was surprised that the wizard would assume that I would have. The wizard straightened his robes and made himself more comfortable in his chair.
In a quiet village nestled between a beautiful river and dense forests, there lived a young farmer and his family. Much like your village, the people lived quiet lives seeking only to live in peace and freedom. But it was not so. The lands they lived in was a rotting corpse of a kingdom ruled by a vicious tyrant. Wars and starvation were as common as the rising of the sun. Its subjects, constantly oppressed by its own government, had become callous and apathetic, resigning its cruelty and injustices as just a normal part of life. One day, a decree was posted in the village square by a representative of the court. Many townsfolk gathered around and read the decree with much anger and incredulousness. It read, "By order of our benevolent king, the following laws have been declared. Effective immediately, all citizens are required to pay a 25% tax on all commodities produced to the king, in addition to the 10% tax on landowning citizens. Due to the increase of spies in our lands from the enemy in the east, a curfew has been put into effect for all citizens. Citizens who remain outside of their homes after sunset will be subject to a fine and imprisonment. No citizens shall possess, trade or produce weapons of any kind, save the blacksmiths in service of the king's army. Violators will be subject to imprisonment or execution, depending on the severity of the crime." The people were furious, but hardened their hearts and continued to live their lives as normal as they could. When the tax had come to be collected, the farmer paid it with much resentment. As a farmer, he was required to give up 25% of his harvest. It was a heavy tax, and as a result, and much to the sorrow of the farmer, the following winter his youngest son died from malnutrition. The farmer was enraged. He shook his fist and cursed God and the wretched king for taking his son. Even after so many injustices, the people did nothing. Then spring came, and a messenger had arrived in the village square from the capital. He stood on a box and began addressing the people.
"Attention, good people, I bring woeful tidings. Our devilish enemy in the east preys upon our lands, destroying and burning our holy churches and monasteries without prejudice. We have endured such slights for many years, but now is the time to harden your hearts and make ready for a coming conflict with these heathens. Would you not lay down your plows for the spear? Would you not risk your lives in the name of God and your King to preserve the sanctity and peace of our glorious kingdom? Now is the time to rise, fellow citizens, and take your places as defenders of the realm as God intended."
This angered the people, but they were also confused. Their village was a mere stone's throw from the border, and nobody had ever heard of such a thing, nor ever seen a single soul from the neighboring kingdom walking their lands. The rage of the people, including the farmers, was palpable, but they quickly returned to their lives and forgot such things. A fortnight passed, and the farmer's wife became very ill. So with great haste the farmer traveled to the nearest monastery where he could purchase medicine from the monks. He traveled with an eager fervor, and it was late at night when he arrived at the monastery. Before entering, he decided to take a quick rest on a large boulder in the courtyard. A few minutes had passed, and he noticed a suspicious-looking man hunched over at a corner of the structure. He heard a striking noise and saw red flashes of sparks in the darkness. It immediately dawned on him this could be a spy for which the town crier spoke of just months ago. He leapt from his place and bounded toward the seedy individual in the dark with remarkable dexterity. He gave a great shout and challenged his intentions. Naturally, the man became quite startled and took to heel. The farmer gave chase, shouting at the man. He came within arm's reach and attempted to seize him. He grabbed his shoulder, but the man lost his balance, and they both tumbled together to the ground in a spectacular tangled web of arms and legs. To the farmer's despair, the man had fallen and hit his head on a sharp stone. A pool of blood began to form around the base of his wound. The farmer panicked, begging God for forgiveness and desperately trying to figure out what to do. He produced a spare shirt from his travel sack and tore it, creating a makeshift bandage. He carefully wrapped it around the man's wound and took a moment to inspect his condition. He was still breathing, a small comfort, but the farmer was still filled with dread at the prospect of the man's survival. Knowing that the man was likely an enemy up to no good, he decided to bind his hands and feet. When the adrenaline wore off, his mental faculties became clearer. It then occurred to him that he should fetch the physician of the monastery. He swiftly rose to his feet and went to collect him. When the physician arrived, along with 2 other monks, the man's bleeding had significantly subsided, but he was still unconscious. While they waited for the man to awaken, the farmer explained in great detail his business at the monastery and what had occurred just moments ago. The monks were visibly upset, but nodded and said nothing. When he had awoken, he was questioned meticulously by both parties. The man was terrified, but gathered his wits. This is what he said.
"Please, good sirs, in the name of God, I'm a citizen of this land and a simple craftsman like many others. You know what it's like out there. Poverty and starvation loom over us like a black cloud. I was desperate. My fortune has improved recently as by providence I was selected by a representative of the king to carry out this task, with promise of a great reward and an end to the suffering of my family. I was to burn down this monastery by command of the king. For once this was completed, it would stoke the flames of anger in the people, bring in just cause to make war against our enemies in the east. I swear on my life I was going to alert its inhabitants before the smoke and flames consume them. I beg you to spare my life. In return I shall testify against the king in the presence of all the people. It will either be my salvation or my undoing."
The farmer and the monks spoke in private for a while. Then the decision was made. They released the man, but before doing so made him swear an oath to God to keep his word and to refrain from such wicked activities for the rest of his life. The man accepted graciously with tears in his eyes and kissed their feet. When the farmer returned home, he wasted no time in telling the village what had happened. The rage of the people had manifested into whispers of rebellion, and soon word had spread all across the kingdom of the tyrant's misdeeds. Some of the citizenry claimed it was nothing more than a wild conspiracy, and that while they despised the king as well, they would rather ignore the slights as to not make things worse. But many people had enough. They hammered their plows into spears and sold their cloaks for shields. The wrath of the people was terrible and magnificent to behold. Before the king knew it, The rebellion was on his doorstep. A sea of spears, pitchforks, and torches had materialized outside his very keep. Many men fell on both sides, but the people were victorious. As the executioner wrapped the noose around the tyrant's neck, the air was filled with prayers, insults, and shouts of elation. The people rejoiced in their victory, and as the tyrant king swung from the gallows, the streets were flooded with tears of joy. The land began to heal, and peace was made with many former enemies. But the memory of their misery and suffering at the hands of the tyrant king was not soon forgotten.
The wizard looked at me, waiting for my response. I coughed, straightened myself up in my bed, and said, "That was quite a moving story, wizard, and I think I understand the juxtaposition it intended to convey, that the will of God will always triumph over evil, though it may not happen as quickly or in the manner we expect it to." The wizard nodded with a smile and looked quite pleased, but wagged his finger.
"Close, my friend. You are close, but you miss the mark. What you say is true, but its interpretation is less of a spiritual nature and more of a physical one. The moral of the story is that the righteous man, alone, isolated and apathetic to the woes of the world, is quite ineffective against a united and strong wicked force. When good men do nothing, misery and sadness follow suit. But when the average man unites with his brothers and sisters to resist against the forces of evil, under a common purpose, even hell itself would find it hard-pressed to deny them their just crusade."
I nodded and looked away, deep in thought of such terrifying things. The wizard got up, tossed more wood into the fireplace, and took his leave, quietly shutting the door behind him. I could not help but wonder if such things would still exist in the future. It was difficult to conceive. I knew that mad kings and tyrants have always existed. It is one thing to oppress your own people, but to intentionally destroy your own homeland from within, for the sake of obtaining a little more power, was astonishing to me. Surely as time marches on, we as a species will become wiser and more enlightened. Surely when the needs of every man are met, bathed in the light of abundance, there will be no need for such evil and violence. When a man has a full belly, warm clothes, and a roof over his head, what more could he possibly want? As my storm of thoughts raged in my mind, my eyes wandered around the room until they rested on the window. Beads of water slowly dripped from the eaves. Spring had finally begun to show its welcome face. I smiled, bundled myself tightly, and drifted into sleep.